Hi, everyone. We're going to get started and reclaim our time from our lovely colleagues and get going, because we've got other things on our agenda later today. I want to thank you for sticking with us here this afternoon at Free to Be Anywhere in the Universe, our conference celebrating 25 years of African American studies at Columbia University, and also celebrating our new department, the Department of African American and African Diasporic Studies. Thank you. Proud to be a part of that. Also want to let you know, following this panel, at 6:30 at Harlem Stage, which is at 150 Convent Avenue, Imani Uzuri will close our weekend with her performance, Come On in the Prayer Room. And if you have never seen Imani Uzuri, you need to take the time to go see her, because she is absolutely stupendous, and this project is a great project. So our final panel here at the forum is Imaging Freedom. This panel considers socio-spatial imaginaries and the active visualization, definition, and construction of artistic freedoms. What roles do literature, music, the visual arts, and popular culture play in imagining and articulating trans-diasporic expressions of subjectivity, experience, and memory? How do we today theorize the conditions of possibility for an African diasporic aesthetic while attending to cultural, historical, and geopolitical differences? So we have 4 panelists with us today. We're going to start off moving to my left with Roshini Kempadoo, a media artist, photographer, and scholar. And their extended bios are, of course, in your programs, but I will just give you a little taste of who they are, and encourage you to follow their work. She has a research project, Creating Interference, investigating contemporary artworks as creative responses of memories and historical narratives. She's also contributing visual editor to Small Acts, a Caribbean journal of criticism, published by Duke University Press. And her book is also outside and for purchase, if you would like to purchase it. She will be followed by Kevin Fellezs, my colleague here, who is an assistant professor of music and African American studies, and joined us in 2012 in a joint appointment with the Institute for Research in African American Studies and Music. His book, also outside, titled Birds of Fire, Jazz, Rock, Funk, and the Creation of Fusion, also from Duke University Press, is a study of fusion, that is jazz, rock, funk music of the 70s. He's also published articles in Jazz Perspectives, Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the Institute for Studies of American Music newsletter. Our third panelist is Sandrine Colard, an assistant professor of art history, a writer, and an independent curator. She received her PhD from Columbia University in 2016 from art history, so we're very happy about that. Sandrine is currently preparing The Way She Looks, a history of female gazes in African portraiture, in collaboration with the Arthur Walter Collection, which will be out this year. And she has also been appointed artistic director of the 2019 Lubumbashi Biennial in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and she'll be talking about that project today. And finally, we'll end with Tavia Nyong'o, a professor of African American Studies, and Theater Studies at Yale, where he teaches courses in the intersection of the literary, cultural theory, and creative arts. He has 2 books out. The Amalgamation Waltz, which was published in 2009, and his recent Afro-Fabulations, the queer drama of Black life, that just came out last year from NYU. So please join me in welcoming our panelists.
I just wanted to thank, like everybody else, it's been a fantastic couple of days, and I really wanted to thank Kellie for inviting me and to the organizers of this wonderful event. And whenever I come to the States and contribute, I'm always amazed and blown over by the level of and the breadth of research that's being done here. And I really always get nurtured in this space in terms of moving on. So I wanted to also just refer to the women's voices and action that that are associated with the event, and people like Christina Sharp, Tina Camp, Sadia Hartman, Kellie, Zakiya Jackson, Deborah Thomas, and Deb Willis, who has kindly joined us this evening. So it's very important to me, and I refer to these people, women of color, and these wonderful scholars and artists who influence my work and are really affecting my thought process and how I actually contribute. So I just wanted to start off by thinking about, I don't know if some of you have been following the news in the UK. We've got a kind of a group, the Extinction Rebellion group, and that's an environmental activist group that are doing peaceful protests in the middle of London and are holding up and in effect really bringing forward the idea of thinking about ecological imperatives and urgent matters of the planetary and environmental concerns. And of course there are some comments about the type of organization that they are, which is associated with a more privileged white kind of space, and Galdem, which is an organization that is associated with an activist group that's of color and of non-binary women, has really criticized them for this idea of whitewashing the environmental agenda, which I think is quite an interesting one. You might want to think a little bit about that. So I wanted to talk to you about a fictional piece, and this is really important that you actually go from the headspace from our wonderful sociologists who and contributors in the last panel to a much more poetic kind of space. And I guess it's really thinking through how I work with documents and materials in order to think through a poetic response to that. And so you need to bear in mind that my work and my research comes from that kind of on the ground, listening, speaking, hearing, taking photographs and doing video and audio recordings, but in effect I lift it into a fictional space. So Like Gold Dust is a recent artwork, and it's in the first phase in the beginning of a long-term project, and it was based on a residency at Art Pace with the invitation from guest curator Deb Willis, and is currently on at the gallery in San Antonio until the end of May. And in 2015, I learned of the offshore exploratory work for the potential of oil extraction in Guyana and the announcements made by ExxonMobil in 2015 of offshore oil in the disputed territory off the Essequibo coast in the northwest neighboring country of Venezuela. So this is in Guyana we have found this oil has been found. So the art installation based on in new work has been based on a return visit to Guyana, my ancestral homeland as a daughter of Guyanese parents of the Windrush generation who returned to Guyana during my teenage years. And the trip involved listening, taking photographs, recording audio and video, and observing and experiencing. So Like Gold Dust, like the title implies, is concerned with evoking preciousness and commodity financial value that we all give to the gold as a mineral. And this is the landscape, of course, Guyana and South America, of where the myth of El Dorado is associated. And of course, Guyana also has an enormous amount of gold as well. Walter Raleigh is associated with it, and the notion of adventuring and the notion of building the colonial empire. So the value of gold dust, and of course El Dorado means the golden one, is about a gold rush, a frenzy, a bedazzling, and a policy of immense riches. I should be moving on here. It beggars belief, then, that in this event and discovery is rapidly taking place at this time, that extracting oil and gas as a fossil fuel from a small, precarious, English-speaking Caribbean nation with under 800,000 people, and one of the poorest populations in South America, associated with significant thinkers, activists, and artists. And I think we know that what the impact of oil and gas use is, and how accelerating and damaging it is to the environment. So these are large companies are paving the way to extract oil and gas at unprecedented levels in Guyana by 2025. So I started to talk a little bit, and here you're seeing some of the installation shots of the work at the moment. I started by taking photographs of landscape details, trying to think through the question of materiality, to look more closely at the terrain. An overwhelming sense of a vastness and horizon still drive the type of pictures taken at this stage. But it mostly involved, my work was mostly involved river trips and seeking permission to go onto the land associated with indigenous Guyanese people, involving very small speedboats, school boat runs to small islands, walking in savanna landscapes, and not to detract from the significant and particular histories, the histories of land displacement, reservations, and ownerships associated with the First Nation. That's very similar to the communities in the US. So the project represents a tentative move to trouble definitions of blackness at a point of our cultural history. You're very familiar, probably some of you will be, with the different configurations and legacy of the term black, particularly in the UK. And in a way, I think one of the things that I have always done is to kind of work from within that kind of working political definition of blackness. And in a way, Kellie and Arthur noted yesterday, that, and several others at this event, that blackness is more complicated, and that the Guyanese black experience is even more complex. The project sees racialized spaces to encompass commonality by those who have continue to suffer injustices and dehumanizing experiences as people of color and of the history of slavery who have been subjected to extreme injustices and who have constructed as the enemy and the populations to be feared and be anxious of, and who are perceived as needing to have Trump's wall and borders built. So the project is motivated in a way by reflecting racism and violence as experienced by persons identified as the First Nations in Guyana, and to a less extent in Texas as Latinx characters associated with the living and legacies of migration between Latin America and the US. So the work seeks to embed legacies of commodification of slavery and capital and activism to counter it. And I was thinking of Jaffrey Allen's work, where in effect he was saying, we've got our marching orders, we already have our work cut out for us, and we know what there needs to be done, and things have been lobbied about. So what I have done is also to return to historical texts, as I always do with my artworks as well. So I wanted to just raise the first observation of what the work is attempting to infer, if you like. This is this artwork that's installed. So the production or extraction and subjection of a violent mode of geologic life by Yusuf. And I don't know if some of you are familiar with this text that has come out in 2018. I've been reflecting and engaging with the text A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None by Catherine Yusuf in 2018. As an artist, I make the work first, and then I think consciously about, and then in dialogue with theoretical text, to think through the work implications of what I've made. And I like the way in which she proposes to think geology in relation to race. I cribbed the title because I like the way in which she proposes rereading discourses associated with planetary geological material and its relationship to subjectivities of race. So she does things like substitutes the term production, the creation of capital, for extraction. And she wants to make that kind of notion, that absolute direct connection, from the land or as people, as labor. And the notion of subjection as being more accurately reflecting the impossibilities for subject lives. And she refers here to Hartman's writings of the afterlives of slavery in relation to that. So she's associating subjection with the associations of the violence of slavery. Some of the found published works I researched and worked with to montage and create the artworks were maps, a promotional video from the oil companies, and the symbolism of the oil baron, and modern project of production and wealth in the local Texas archives of oil production and its legacies to Texas. So if we could have the, I'm just going to show you a short minute of a silent video that's part of the installation. If we can have that playing now, that would be great. It's So that's to just give you an idea of how I the aesthetics of the video work that I've put together. So Yusuf considers the ways in which the afterlives of slavery continued, of black folks, continued in building roads and extracting new forms of energy, of indigenous dispossession of land and the sovereignty. So she's actually thinking through this notion of extraction in relation to the continued afterlives of slavery and how black folk were connected to that. And absolutely connected to it. So she refers to Stephanie Lemanager's work, where she comments about oil literally was conceived as a replacement for slave labor. Yusuf names geological discourses thus far as white geology, and in doing so makes legible a set of extractions from particular subject positions. The history of blackness, she suggests, by its very negation in the category of non-being within economies of whiteness, live differently in the earth. These are just some of the archives and material that I've been working with and I researched. Like Gold Dust attempts a symbolic and audio visualization of white economics and its connection to the notion of extraction of resources, indigenous dispossession through a layering aesthetics of rupture, fragmentation. And I was thinking of the discussion that Arthur Jaffa's interpretation of the gaze in particular, where I worked with this idea of the good, godlike status of the white and very male status of the oil baron. And you can see that I worked with that in the video. And I also was thinking through this notion of the connection to the wealth in the West. So I'll just show you some of the exhibition prints, a selection of them as I made them, and these are the exhibition prints in the gallery space. So another kind of issue I'd like to raise in relation to the making of the work is this idea of slow violence and the hybrid auto-instituting, languaging, storytelling species, which I love as an expression that Winter uses, for us to think about how we actually describe ourselves in relation to that. So I just wanted to refer you to an extract of, from the audio script and the narration that actually forms part of the installation that you can hear in the gallery space. And I'll just read out a couple of, a small proportion of that, where she says, "I write to you as a way to commit to memory the work we have done together, to remember our long-standing friendship and to share with others living here in Wakapau. It was you too, Rosa, such a good friend, who saw me through the years when I was studying to be a pharmacist in Florida. We both didn't know how tough it was going to be to survive in that crazy city Gainesville, with its huge shopping malls and thousands of fast food restaurants offering all you can eat. So the audio work I developed was based on being influenced by what I heard and saw in Guyana and San Antonio. I met incredible women activists in Texas, and based on the work by activists I know in Guyana, and for example, Red Thread of the work of Karen D'Souza and Elisa Trotz in the University of Toronto, who actually helps to document and make visible the work that Red Thread are doing in Guyana. So it was really trying to think about women being evoked as agents of environmental and socio-political change through evoking the dialogue as fictional characters within which Rosa names Wangari Maathai, and some of you will be familiar with who she is as an environmental activist who is now passed. I was particularly interested in how this might be evoked in the installation through sound and the use of music, as well as the photographs that make up the installation. I devised the monologue, to enact what I called an emplaced rhetoric, a term describing the way in which environmental activists like Wangari Maathai's writing in particular encourage collaboration and empathy to causes. As Ellen Gozewski notes, Wangari uses "I noticed" and "I observed" to position the audience to see through her with new eyes, as if the audience was standing in her place and viewing the scenario. So I'm going to skip through, and just to show you some of the other images that I'm working with, and I actually have that I actually took in Guyana that become part of the installation as well. And here I'm just going to summarize, but I was thinking about Chris Cozier as a Trinidadian artist who works and supports Caribbean art and artists in the Caribbean. And he was interviewed earlier this year in the UN as part of the transatlantic slave remembrance project. And his words for me resonated with my own practice as someone in the Caribbean. And I quote, I'm just going to give you a short extract from it. "I am an artist, I'm not necessarily a politician or an activist. The place that we entered as property, not as people, but as property. We became the subjects of the crown, and then we are now having a conversation about citizenship and participation. So that's a hell of a journey in a relatively short space of time, and in a very small place with people from various ethnicities." I'm just going to move on with some of these images. As you can see them, I'm just not going to talk directly to them. So it's coming from a place where both bodies and the lands were exploited for capital gain. So many writers, thinkers have emerged from this history. This is Chris talking still. Obviously, the struggle to be a person, to be an individual, and to engage the world is some sort of political response to such a bizarre moment in history. It's been a catalyst. So you can say on the one side, look how much we have suffered, and on the other side, look how much we've accomplished, or have done, or how influential we've been. And I think that really resonates with how we might think about this notion of slavery in a more kind of moving forward space, if you like. I'm just going to flip through some of these and move on to just showing you some of the more exhibition pieces. And lastly, I just wanted to raise the possibility of imagining. And my way of constituting and being reminded of a possibility of a future, particularly in this moment, is not only acknowledging the writings of a more pessimistic nihilism, apocalyptic and dystopian images of the future, but also consider the possibilities, glimpses from imagination, from the space in which the imagination escapes and takes flight. So I love the work of Nalo Hopkinson, and so good to hear Zakia Jackson refer to her important writing yesterday. Some others around fantasy fiction and Afrofuturist projects are also of interest to me, so people like Wangechi Mutu, Ellen Gallagher, George Clinton, Sunra Orchestra, for example. They conceive of other planets, associations with other worlds in which the planet was not for us, or technological prosthetics and extensions to the human body. I infer in this project, like Gold Dust, as alchemy, with sounds, readings, and visuals as a magical process combining transformation and creation and imagination, and counterbalancing the systemic violence towards black bodies. And I'm just showing you here, and I wanted to refer you to a poem that's also part of the installation. The work by the First Nations, for example, continued to remind us through protest movements and poetic spaces. The poem, as part of the installation by Sarah Russell, Little Crow Russell, offers a sharply focused commentary of elements involving a protest through performance. And I'm thinking of the ghost dance that she refers to. She picks up on a historical narrative, and beneath the surface of the earth are lurking in the cracks in the concrete and from the tree roots as they receive nourishment from the rain, the possibility of revolution once more. Earth elements containing memory, such as trees, their roots, dust, soil, river, water, wake, are posed as alternative evocations. And I'm thinking about Christina Sharp's work here, which is important. I noticed that she was proposing to rethink representations and knowledge production, and that this might be done through reflecting on the materiality and the viscerality of our surroundings. So the experiential reality of the land and scapes are the things of intrigue and further inquiry here. The importance of the visit to Guyana, and particularly the Essequibo, which will become associated with the largest offshore oil production space of the planet, became the urgent specific landscape to render. So here I'm actually just showing you some of the archive material of some of the research work I did, which provides that kind of link between the oil and the protest movements that's happening in Texas. And obviously you guys would know more about this, but it for me was really influential in the making of the work. And I'm particularly interested in the way in which we might be thinking about and giving reference to the level of political activity where women are working within the kind of political system, very much at risk within the system in order to kind of bring about change. And so I wanted to kind of reflect that and pay homage to that in a way. And I'm thinking of the Democratic US representatives that we now have, including people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Deborah Harlan, etc. And of course, we also have this experience of this idea of a formulation and a kind of a gathering of women of color also in Europe, and politically being motivated to take action as well. So these are the last three images from of exhibition prints from Like Gold Dust, which I brought to show you. And I guess in this evocation, what I'm trying to do is an inextricable link I gesture towards through a fictional and imagined space, and a link that contains possibilities but also embeds the historical stuff of legacies and nightmares. Slavery followed by indentureship, the violence towards and displacement acts of First Nation peoples by settler colonialists, inhuman acts, white privilege and supremacy. The work gestures towards how we might nevertheless still try to constitute our black bodies as sovereign, and how we might do this to include attending to thinking and being and being that requires a step change. And it seems to me that that step change is very urgent now. And it's about that relationship to the materiality of the landscape and the terrain that I want to explore. Thank you.
While they're setting me up, I just want to join in thanking Farrah Griffin and Kellie Jones for giving me the opportunity to participate in this wonderful weekend with everyone else. All right, at the purchaser's option, questions of freedom.
With your life like this, with you an artist, with you an activist, and you're a mother, do you have to balance that? Do you, I see pictures of you with your babies on the road with you and everything, and I think, one part of me thinks she looked like she just incorporates it all together and she can pull this off. But there's another part that's like, do you have to say, I have to set this aside and I have to just concentrate on this? Like, does that ever?
If I was a guy, would you ask me that question?
Rhiannon Giddens returns the question to her interrogator, answering his question with a question of her own. An act of questioning that speaks to her agency, critical acumen, and willingness to challenge convention and commonsensical assumptions. I want to suggest that what Giddens' pointed question actually asks is, if I were free, would you ask me that question? What questions might we ask of each other and of ourselves if we were truly free? Trained at Oberlin as an opera singer, Rhiannon Giddens first rose to public prominence as a founding member, along with Dom Flemons and Justin Robinson, of the Carolina Chocolate Drops, an African-American trio of bluegrass and old-time musicians. Recognized as an accomplished banjo player and violinist, though she might prefer the term fiddler, Giddens' musical practices resound and amplify the lingering echoes of Black slaves' imaginings of freedom through song. Indeed, rather than framing her critique through jazz, hip-hop, or other Black-identified genres, Giddens revisits and refigures the foundational influence of Black American musicians on bluegrass and the string band tradition. Much of the scholarship on Afro-diasporic music cultures focuses on those forms most readily heard as Afro in some way. The Afro-Caribbean music worlds of the son, merengue, calypso, and reggae, for instance. Or the music cultures found in South America, such as the cumbia and favela funk, or in North America, the genres of jazz, the blues, and hip-hop. All hybrid musical forms that yet manage to sound out a Black aesthetic and sensibility, no matter the level of commercialization, mixture with non-Black musics, or performance by non-Black musicians. But I want to think or rethink our ideas about bluegrass, old-time, and folk music through the music of Rhiannon Giddens, in order to ask different questions about the conditions of possibility for an African diasporic aesthetic, as our panel description puts it. What sort of questions might form when considering bluegrass music as Afro-diasporic? Reclaiming the banjo as an African-derived instrument, Giddens questions the presumed whiteness of old-time and bluegrass music, as well as the erasure of Black musicians in the creation and development of those traditions. The banjo's 500-year history in this country speaks to the process of the Africanization of North American culture, particularly its music and dance, though of course we can see it everywhere else, right? Language, fashion. Though we don't know the precise songs Africans sang on those slave ships crossing the Middle Passage, journals by European and US American travelers and captains' logs describe what can only be called lamentations. The wailing, the wild noise of the captive Black bodies alarmed the captains and slave traders, who surmised that depressed or deceased cargo made for slim profits in the New World. So ship captains began to coerce their human cargo to sing happy-sounding songs, rather than the wailing songs the Africans would sing, if at all, and forcing them with cat-o'-nine-tails to dance to keep their bodies in strong physical condition, all with an eye to preserving Black bodies for profit in the slave market. Later on shore, slaves were compelled to sing happy music while dancing as best they could in coffles en route to auction sites to demonstrate their willing acquiescence to their bondage, as well as their physical and mental fitness, and implicitly the benevolence of the slaver. The happy singing and dancing darkies emerging from Aunt Hester's scream were remixed on the minstrel stage to misrepresent the bleak, inhumane practices and the body subjected to this nation's peculiar institution as primary sites of performed freedoms, forming one of the paradoxes of Black performance in the New World. It is unsurprising then that the banjo was isolated in Black music culture for most of its history due to its status as a plantation instrument. White musicians had little interest in picking up the slave instrument until they used it to convey racial stereotypes in minstrelsy, when its association with Black slaves was still widely recognized among whites and Blacks. As Blacks abandoned the banjo for the guitar in the early 20th century, the former was increasingly heard as a white instrument, as it remained a vital part of bluegrass and other country music styles. Giddens' original song, At the Purchaser's Option, which inspired the title to my talk, explores the relationship between the purchaser and the purchased through questions. I will let Giddens explain the song's origin, but I want us to think about questions, or more specifically, the act of questioning, as we listen to the song. Giddens asks a number of poignant questions in her song. In fact, she begins and ends the song with a question. In doing so, Giddens gives voice to the inner anxieties of a woman unable to air them, gifting the woman a voice through her song. And what does this silenced woman do with her newfound voice? She asks a question no one able to answer her at the time would have thought she had the maternal sense to ask. Giddens, similar to her pointed reply to Kyle Meredith, uses questions to critique white assumptions while humanizing Black perspectives.
And so this song was inspired after reading or looking at an advertisement in a book for a human being, for a young woman. And it just kind of talked about her, and she's 22, young, good worker, that kind of thing. And at the end of it, it was just, as if in an afterthought, it said she has with her a 9-month-old baby who is at the purchaser's option. And it just kind of made me really sad. And then the way I deal with all the stuff inside as I write now. So this song came out of that, thinking about what her life was like and how lucky I am. Shall I keep him? 'Twill come the day when I'll be weeping. But how can I love him any less? This little babe upon my breast. You can take my body, you can take my bones, you can take my blood, but not my soul. You can take my body, you can take my bones, you can take my blood, but not my soul. I've got a body dark and strong. I was young, but not for long. You took me to bed, a little girl. Left me in a woman's world. You can take my body, you can take my bones, you can take my blood, but but not my soul. You can take my body, you can take my bones, you can take my blood, but not my soul. You can take my body, take my bones, you can take my blood, but not my soul. I've got a babe, but shall I keep it?
While Giddens may be singular, she is not alone. She draws from the rich traditions of the largely unsung black roots of bluegrass and old-time music, particularly the Piedmont area's rich legacy of black string band and blues musicians. And two of the more famous ones you can see there, Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee. The finger-picking style of guitar playing you find in bluegrass and other country and folk music styles, for instance, is a legacy of the black string band performers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As music historian Steve Waxman notes, quote, historians and folklorists have located the roots of fingerstyle playing in the area around Muhlenberg County in western Kentucky. The style was most likely of African-American derivation, a product of the influential but largely ignored black string band traditions that flourished in parts of the South during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, to be largely displaced by the popularization of the blues. Arnold Schultz, a black American guitarist, a near mythic figure in the history of old-time music, whose influence was felt by scores of performers in the western Kentucky area, was perhaps the most notable early guitar player using fingerstyle technique, end quote. And that includes Bill Monroe, sort of the white father of bluegrass music, who credits Arnold Schultz with teaching him how to fingerpick. I don't have time today to go through all these sort of other examples, right, of black musicians playing country music. But I do want to mention Lil Hardin, Louis Armstrong's second wife, plays a piano on the 1930 Blue Yodel No. 9 by Jimmy Rogers, which is a sort of foundational text in country music. Right? And I do want to mention DeFord Bailey, who is a harmonica player and was a Grand Ole Opry star, performed at Grand Ole Opry from 1927 to 1941. Tina Turner's first solo recording is a country recording, covers Dolly Parton, James Taylor, called Tina Turns the Country On. And then, Odetta. Al Green also releases a country record in 1977 called Belle. And Odetta's famously 1956 recording, Odetta Sings Ballads and Blues, influences Bob Dylan to give up rock and roll and electric guitar for folk music in the acoustic guitar. And it continues, right? And currently the #1 record on the top Billboard 100 is Lil Nas X, right? Old Town Road, right? So it continues. I just sort of wanted to, and that's Jimmy Lane there performing at the Grand Ole Opry, right? So she's not alone. Additionally, Giddens performs Celtic music, winning awards for singing in Irish. No mean feat even for native Irish speakers. But she imbues traditional music from the British Isles in the same way she highlights the histories behind bluegrass songs by revealing the voices of the silenced, the voices of those who cannot question. For example, in her updating of Factory Girl, a traditional British folk song, Giddens knits together the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire in 1911 to the 2013 Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh, in which over 1,000 garment workers met their death, and thousands more were seriously injured. In following the folk music tradition of grafting topical lyrics onto older songs as melodies, bringing social issues into the public square in a way that is sonically familiar and thus effectively resonant with audiences, Giddens asks us to reflect on our own complicity with present-day peonage as first-world consumers, observing that, quote, "It made me think about the cost of fast fashion and for those $6.99 specials, for the closets full of clothes that we all have. Somebody's paying for it, it's just not us," end quote. Who is the purchaser with options here? Not content to merely chronicle the disasters of the past as signposts to the present, Giddens performed We Are the 99 at Occupy Wall Street on October 16, 2011, which became an anthem of sorts for the movement at the time. More recently, she wrote Cry No More in response to the June 2015 massacre at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. In this excerpt of the song, Giddens' use of a Native American hand drum signals her own Native lineage, connecting another set of histories and imaginings for freedom.
500 years of poison. I can't cry no more. 500 years of grief. I can't cry no more. 500 years of reason. I can't cry no more. To weep with disbelief. I can't cry no more. The legacy is mighty. We can't cry no more. We can't carry this alone. We can't cry no more. You have to help us fight it. We can't cry no more. Then together we'll be home. We can't cry no more. Then together we'll be home. We can't cry no more. Then together we'll be home. We can't cry no more.
Black is the Color is a 17th century folk song, usually given a melancholic reading. Compare the version we will hear shortly with Nina Simone's version, for example. In Giddens' gifted hands, the song is reinvented as an up-tempo celebration of the long history of black musicking in this country. By fusing folk and country music with Zydeco, New Orleans rhythm and blues, and human beatboxing in a performance accompanied by a multiracial band, Giddens' joyful performance demonstrates the myriad forms black musicians have given us. The video adds the Fisk Jubilee Singers into the mix, at least visually, who, as the first black musicians to sing authentic black music, the spiritual, to white audiences when minstrelsy was the popular music of the day, points to the long history of black musicians questioning normative social relations through their musicking. In other words, black musicians have always provided those whose questions have been unasked a voice through which their questions might be heard.
Black is the color of my true love's hair. His lips are like some rosy fair. The sweetest face and the neatest hands. I love the ground whereon he stands. Soft is the feel of my true love's skin, and strong the arms he folds me in. The clearest eyes and the truest heart. He lets me start before I start.
Reimagining Black is the Color as joyful celebration rather than sorrowful lament, Giddens reveals how black musicians question norms and imagine freedoms not only through trials and tribulations, but also through joy and love, performing music as a way to connect them to their ancestors, as well as reaching forward to those who follow in their footsteps. It is within these histories and futurities in which banjos and fiddles, black singers and dancers join feet, hands, and voices to question a world which judges them askance, to ask if freedom can be more than simply imagined. It should be too obvious to state, a question worth asking. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me properly? Yes. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be back to my alma mater for this celebration of the anniversary of the Institute of Research of African American Studies. The pressure is definitely on with mentors, longtime heroes, and former professors on the panel. Between 2004 and 2007, the blockbuster and controversial exhibition, Africa Remix, The Contemporary Art of a Continent, toured 3 continents. Curated by the French-based Cameroonian Simon Jamy, the show traveled from Paris to Düsseldorf, London, Tokyo, Stockholm, and Johannesburg. The global itinerancy of the show, as well as its interactivity, 4 different websites and 1 CD-ROM accompanied it, was itself a declaration of cosmopolitanism and of the 21st centuryness of contemporary African arts. No less than 4 versions of the catalog were produced by the different venues welcoming the show. The one produced by the Johannesburg Art Gallery was augmented by the English translation of an important and since then very commented text. Entitled Afropolitanism, this essay by the influential thinker Achille Mbembe conceptualized the Afropolitan idea that he described as the transnational cultures of 21st century African identified urbanites. Both in and off the continent, Mbembe described the Afropolitan experience as originating in the perpetual movements that have historically characterized African populations, from labor migrations and slavery to post-colonial diasporas and exiles. It is from these itinerancies, physical, but also mental, and nowadays online, and from their seamless interlacing that was born a new aesthetic and poetics of the world. Mbembe saw this Afropolitanism reflected in the African artists of Africa Remix, in their, quote, awareness of the interweaving of the here and there, the presence of the elsewhere in the here and vice versa, to domesticate the unfamiliar, to work with what seems to be opposites, end of quote. Nowadays, the global metropolises of the world, Paris or New York, Dakar or Lagos, London or Houston, are bursting with African and African-descending individuals whose identities and mental geographies are radically plural. However, Afropolitanism has also become a highly contested idea. In the wake of its first appearance in a 2005 article by writer Taiye Selassie, the term was quickly recuperated as a rallying brand for the urban hip life of an often diasporic, highly educated middle class, and the dominance of fashion and lifestyle has made the concept being accused of commodity fetishism, elitism, and class bias. Regular disavowals of the idea are professed in print and online, backed by well-known intellectuals such as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and anti-manifestos explaining why I am not an Afropolitan battle with proponents of this self-proclaimed identity. In the media arena and public discourses, the global popularity and privileging of elements of pop culture, consumerism, and neoliberal luxury has tended to eclipse the more theoretical Afropolitanism of Mbembe and others. However, I argue that the critical edge of Mbembe's theory is reactivated when one is attentive to the profound ambivalence of the mobilities that underlies the Afropolitan experience. Once the one-dimensional and celebratory discourse circulated in media and popular culture becomes more tuned to the realities of African mobilities. In their most recent and dramatic form, the African migrations that have been part of the European refugee crisis since 2014 have claimed the lives of thousands, drowned in the Mediterranean Sea. But even in less tragic circumstances, Africans' travels within their own continent and beyond are far from being unhindered. In a provoking article published on the well-known website Africa is a Country, author Vicso Onye asserts that, quote, citizenship is the most powerful currency today, often superseding race, end of quote. Being the bearer of an African passport often means the end of many, if not all, traveling ambitions. And as Achille Mbembe was saying this morning at a conference, to hold an African passport is really to be conscious of a segmented planet of multiple speeds. Taking just the example of the United Kingdom, so Onye reveals that citizens of African countries have nearly 50% of all applications denied. All of us with African relatives have witnessed cases of family members spread around the world and prevented from seeing each other for years or unable to pursue studies even when accepted to respected institutions for lack of visas authorizations. Unambiguously, the article concludes that, I quote, the privileges and restrictions of nationality loom as the apartheid of 21st century, end of quote. In these conditions, Mbembe's recognition of a new aesthetic and poetics of the world, which, in spite of it all, still weaves the here and there, the presence of the elsewhere in the here and vice versa, that domesticates the unfamiliar, that work with what seems to be opposite, takes an even more critical and resilient tone. Last year, I was invited by WILS, the first contemporary art institution in Brussels, Belgium, to curate an exhibition based on the group of African artists who completed residences in their walls since 2015. Today, an integral component of the art world landscape, residencies put artists in motion around the globe while simultaneously immersing them in one place for a definite period of time. Artists, and African artists in particular, have become successive locals of multiple places and cities. They have become de facto Afropolitan artists. If this cosmopolitanism is true for a majority of the world's artists, it is particularly true for African artists, as the ecology of the art world and residencies still predominantly occurs in the West. And this is the imbalance that the artist Kehinde Wiley designates as the motivation behind his newly opened residency program, Black Rock, in Dakar, Senegal. All the 8 artists gathered in the WILS show live or maintain a strong physical and mental anchor in Africa, but as many of today's African artists, they are regularly in residence away from home. 5 of them, the Congolese Jean Katambai, Sinzo Anza, George Senga, Nelson Makengo, and the South African Simlikiwe Bulungu, had been resident at WILS. The works of 3 additional artists, the Nigerian Emeka Ogbo, the Botswana-born Pamela Fatimo Sundstrom, and the Benin-born Pelagic Bagidi, had been created between Berlin, Paris, Brussels, and Umbria, Italy. Struck by the concomitance of the WILS creation of this residency program for African artists, with the beginning of the refugee crisis and its deadly management by European governments, I could not help but contemplate the paradox of being an African artistic resident when so many Africans are denied access to Europe, but also when for almost none of these artists, mobility is a given. In spite of the featured artists' already well-established reputations, some had to postpone their residency because their visa had not arrived. Others had to shorten their residency because a renewal was rejected, and some will not be able to make it to the opening next month because of the discouragement in the face of the high price or complication of having to go through that whole process again. Yet, all their works reflect a profound entanglement with the world, a way of being in the world, of being in conversation with it, while at the same time they confront but also trump the physical limitations imposed upon them. In the face of this sort of situations, the criticism of Afropolitanism as an elitism of cultural brokers and artists evolving in allegedly privileged circles reveals inadequate. It is in this sense that I consider Afropolitanism a valid and useful concept, one which designates a cosmopolitanism that is specific to contemporary Africans, one that is often reached through another particular road, riddled with obstacles overcome. The exhibition, Multiple Transmissions, reflects the complexities of this cosmopolitanism or Afropolitanism. Through this title, I hope to make visible both the wide variety of artistic legacies that these contemporary African artists combine, as well as the ways in which these connections and transmissions operate, spilling over erected borders. Altogether, the exhibition's photographs, videos, installations, and paintings speak of connection between cities, of networks, of ideas, and renewed subjects of portraiture, of transmissions, of sounds, energies, and histories. The poster for the exhibition shows the detail of an artwork by Nigerian artist Emeka Ogbo. A stained glass lightbox in the shape of a triptych in yellow and copper tones, this piece diffuses the sound of a highly slowed down and unrecognizable sample of a Fela Kuti song. Entitled Spirit and Matter, that piece takes a photograph of the underbridge area of Ojuelegba in the city with the well-known Danfo yellow buses ubiquitous in the streets of Lagos. Ojuelegba is an extremely busy place where is situated a bus terminal, a point of convergence of West Africa, really a point of passage. It also used to be the site of a shrine for the deity Eshu. That photograph is then manipulated to look prism-like, emphasizing the lens through which the artist or the viewer perceives the city, being in Lagos, Berlin, or elsewhere. Ogbo also mixes the spiritual and religious Yoruba undertones with that of Christian Europe, with the end result looking like a cathedral-like stained glass windows. Entitled Spirit and Matter, the artist distinguishes between the physical and the spiritual, but also between his own physical wandering in the world and his mental wandering, bringing him back to Lagos. Jean Katambayi is a Congolese artist whose practice has been fundamentally marked by the mechanization of his native town, Lubumbashi, in the Belgian colonial period. A son of an employee of the famous local mine built by colonials, the then regulation of Congolese lives through clocks, sirens, curfews with lights on or off, and their residue into present day really determine his interest in his own practice. Today, the power outage that regularly cuts off the country, the Congo, from light and from digital contact with the world have made the artists create ingenious circuits as well as a series of drawings. Minutiously pen-drawn and entitled Visa Afro Lamps, the artist imagines deformed light bulbs created by Africans and bringing the light from the proverbial heart of darkness in a literal inversion of enlightenment. Stamped with the word passport, visa, migrant, and also coltan, the material essential to cell phones, of which the Congo soil is one of the world's main purveyor, the artist also acknowledges the administrative and capitalist elements weighing upon him. Pelagique Gbagidi, in her series Defossilizing the Gaze, Dialogue with the Madonna del Parto, was created during her residency in Italy at the Foundation Civitella Ranieri. The resulting works deal with questions such as migrant coming into contact with Italians once arriving on the Italian shores in recent years, with the omnipresent representation in the region of the Madonna, especially in Renaissance painting. Impressed by the paintings of Piero della Francesca, Gbagidi wonders about the figure of the Madonna as a symbol of comfort, welcome, love, but also suffering in European culture in relation to the fate of African migrants. The artist is also interested in the fact that the dehumanization of migrants is also due to their faith, often Islam, and therefore different from the European and Italian tradition in particular. George Senga's photographic series, Street Vendors, is the epitome of these multi-directional exchanges of Afropolitanism. At the end of the Mobutu's regime, the opening up of the borders made local eager to access a greater mobility. Buses were bought in Tanzania and then were renamed Dubai from where they were originally imported. But because custom fees were too high to bring them into the Congo, bootlegs, DVDs from Nollywood, Hollywood, and Southeast Asia were offered to these custom officers in replacement of money. These objects then ended up being part of a growing market of film that sprung on the streets of Lubumbashi. Here then, media and films literally become currency that crosses and transcends borders. Another example of one of the artists here is Nelson Makengo, who uses figurines of Iron Man to embody the superhero qualities that surviving in the streets of Kinshasa requires on a day-to-day basis. All of these artists, if they are not always allowed to be physically anywhere in the universe, are certainly so creatively. Most of these artworks will travel to the Congo to be included in the Biennale of Lubumbashi this fall, the native country of many of these artists. As a sort of repatriation of African contemporary artworks, still predominantly shown and collected in the West, local Congolese audiences will be able to see works by their own artists. And it is interesting to note how this debate about the repatriation of African artworks has been focused only on traditional, really showing the hegemony of a Eurocentric vision of what proper African art is, when it hasn't touched at all the fact that contemporary African art is mainly not on the African continent. Transmission has been a fundamental idea to our understanding of art's evolution, especially when applied to African arts. Ossifying notions of authenticity and unchanging traditions have long prevailed. Yet, the emergence of African contemporary art scenes has continuously short-circuited the conventional art history narratives to the point of having Bembe affirms that, in fact, what we call tradition does not exist. The merit of Afropolitanism still is to force us to reckon with the multiplicity of transversal and global influences and legacies that inform African artists today. At a time when political regimes in the world demonstrate an alarming rise of xenophobia, when borders are everywhere closing and migrants left to die on the shores of Europe, Afropolitanism offers a formidable example of transcendence of geographies, nationalities, languages, or time zones. Thank you.
Thanks. So bringing up the close of this panel, I want to begin by thanking Professor Farrah Griffin and Professor Kellie Jones for the kind invitation. And I've learned so much over the past couple days for the events that I've been able to take part in and to hear. This piece, which I'm going to get right into, resonates with some things that have come up so far, but is also from the work that I'm doing towards an editorial project. I'm in the process of co-editing the final writings of the Havana-born queer of color scholar Jose Munoz. And so the text, as you'll see, is an investigation into the intersections of blackness and brownness. So this talk begins in the bowels of the museum, a space that we might think of as a hold for both freedom and captivity. The performance I want to discuss and to bring into conversation with the themes of this panel occurred in the Museum of the University of California, Riverside. a public university serving a predominantly non-white student body. To set the scene for this performance of Fugitive Camp, picture an eerie mechanized exoskeleton hoisted from the ground to hover above us, the work of Latinx sculptor and installation artist Chico McMurtry. Along with his collective ARW, Amorphic Robotic Works, McMurtry is dedicated to the study and creation of movement as it is expressed in anthropomorphic, organic, and abstract robotic forms. As the audience gathers in the center of the museum under one of these such abstract robotic forms, we have occasion to reflect upon the bricolage aesthetics through which minoritarian artists wield the master's tools against the master's edifice. McMurtry's ephemeral machines redouble the stable structure of the imposing edifice, but in such a way as to remind us that its architecture can be infiltrated and hacked. It is in the spirit of such bricolage, such piecing together of the seemingly unlike, that I offer my account of imagining otherwise. Hybrid Alternos by the Cuban-American sisters Carmelita Tropicana and Ella Troiano is a performance full of chusma, a form of Cuban diasporic humor long associated with blackness. In my research in transnational Black queer performance, I've come to think of chusma as a racialized form of camp, one that bears particular ethno-national specifics that I can only partly decode, but which circulates in the polyglot and rhizomatic worlds of queer of color performance. Chusma, Jose Munoz has noted in his writings on Tropicana, operates as a, quote, barely veiled racial slur suggesting that one is too black, unquote. A blackness not initially visible becomes audible or expressed in such a way as to disrupt a stultifying and whitened atmosphere. When I saw Hybrid Alternos performed in 2018 as part of the performances accompanying the art exhibition Mundos Alternos, Art and Science Fiction in the Americas, the audience felt such chusmeria right from the start. As the performer, Carmelita Tropicana, emerged from under a shiny silver makeshift contraption that could have been a robot or a spaceship, she confronted the audience with a particularly abject offering. Caquita, caquita, she asked those of us gathered in the front rows. Who wants caquita? Using the Spanish diminutive for caca, a word which needs no translation, she went on to promise with obscene relish, I give you caquita if you tell me what shithole country you come from. For a predominantly black and brown audience in Southern California, Tropicana's question was met with nervous laughter. Actually, this audience took it better. Even an irreverent evocation of the US president's obscene disparagement of the countries of Africa and Latin America from which many are seeking refuge in the global north cannot fail to also terrify those of us whose names and visages bear the stamp of this difference. But the power of this performance, in its cutting humor, was to create a temporary space of belonging, what Munoz in his late writings called a brown commons, a dwelling together in difference, in but not of the museum and its curatorial protocols. In the decolonial space fantasia that follows, Tropicana plays Hiye, an interspecies human-hyena hybrid who falls in with Botina, an illegal, artificially intelligent android. And together the two embark on an interstellar search for sanctuary, ending up on the planet Nebula. There, the pair must seek asylum through making a video application in which they retell the narrative of their life, presenting themselves as potentially useful to the local citizenry. So Sandrine's discussion just now of the segmented planet of different speeds very much resonates with this performance. Hiye and Botina do a fairly ramshackle job of presenting themselves as suitable migrants before they call on one of the curators of the exhibit, the scholar Armando Garcia, bring him up to the stage to moderate a talkback in which the audience is empowered to decide in Brechtian fashion whether Hiye and Botina should be admitted. We are increasingly familiar with works of social practice that seek to engage museum audiences as a potential demos. I participated in many of these myself. For some performance scholars, such as Shannon Jackson, this aesthetic this aesthetic works to model a Deweyan public sphere. What was interesting about the talk back with Hiye and Botina as two feral, queer, non-human creatures is that it was staged in such a way as to interrupt this idealistic vision. Because their appearances had already been staged through live video application that addressed the audience as a community empowered to decide on their very humanity, the proposal to vote was rendered deeply complicit with the power of state authorities to make or unmake unlivable lives. The parody of contemporary border violence is explicit, as Hybrid Alternos places incredible pressure on the democratic fantasies of a white settler colonial nation. While the performers in question do not identify as Black, and the setting along the US-Mexican border seems to emphasize other priorities than those which typically drive an Africana aesthetics, I believe the contemporary moment with which the media signposts as the global migrant crisis allows us to think further about the ways these crises can become entangled with each other. One such entanglement in the play is Hiei herself, the human-hyena hybrid, who is a direct evocation of Africa, both of the Serengeti, East African habitat of the spotted hyena, and, as Botina informs her audience, the birthplace of humankind. Homo sapiens emerged from sub-Saharan Africa, Botina says in the play, and ruled the world called Earth until the beginning of the 21st century in human dates, unquote. This performance, let us recall, took place within the context of an exhibit devoted to Latinx interventions in science fiction, and is thus part of this, many millions of Anthropocenes emerging from the global South. What would it mean to take it up within and for a Black diasporic frame of analysis as well? In the rest of this paper, I want to link this aesthetic strategy with the thinking of Sylvia Wynter, for whom the aesthetic holds precisely this potential to refuse and reframe the normative human. Wynter's sociogenic theory of the human may enable us to read the stakes of this satire of refuge differently, and even to see the human hyena through another lens. Is Hiei simply to be dismissed as tropic camp, a pastiche of colonial tropes about sub-Saharan Africa, repeating the tactic made famous by the Lion King of replacing Black Africans with anthropomorphic animals? Or might we find ways to imagine Hybrid Alternos as a call to employ the mutating and migrating creature as a speculative means for thinking and feeling across the incommensurate? Camping the discourse of human species, as the burlesque of scientific reason and linear temporality shows, makes necessary an affective critique of ideologies that were never designed for minoritarian life. Before going further into this question, it will be necessary to parse further the phrase Black and brown that I used just now as a convenient descriptive shorthand for specifying a racial politics of prospective solidarity along an Afro-Latinx continuum. And this phrase is an analog to the political definition of Blackness that Roshini Kempadoo, mentioned just now earlier in relation to the UK. So Black there, we could talk about this in the Q&A, but Black and brown is sort of being used in this moment in the US in a similar way. I'm curious to know if it's being used that way elsewhere. This phrase has quickly entered the contemporary American lexicon, and that very ease ought to give us some occasion to pause. There are real limits of this phrase. Of course, its additive nature. It includes brownness by placing it alongside and coeval with Blackness. It resembles other compound phrases, like the academic term ethno-racial, perhaps even gender and sexuality, in overriding the immense potential consequences of choosing one analytic over the other. At best, Black and brown seem to defer a reckoning with the real work of inventing and sustaining the kinds of political and institutional configurations in which the coalitions of the dispossessed being imagined here could really be efficacious. Alongside the additive usage where brown stands in for Latinx, with the problematic elision of Afro-Latinx populations, there is another way of deploying the term that is even more alarming, at least to me. In phrases like the browning of America, brown comes to stand in for nothing less than racial whitening, a meaning made explicit in the title of a recent political bestseller by Steve Phillips, Brown is the New White, from 2016. Poorly timed publication. This is an odd citation, admittedly, in a talk about aesthetics, but I think it is an important one. Lest the book seem in any way marginal to the political discourse in the contemporary US, the paperback version of Brown is the New White comes with endorsements from both Senator Cory Booker and Senator Kamala Harris, both currently running for the Democratic presidential nomination. And actually Van Jones co-signs on this book. So it thus represents the most immediate example of the majoritarian fantasy of the Obama era, in which the myth of post-racialism took hold in ways that we are still reckoning with, even if revanchist white nationalism has made that reckoning urgently necessary. In electoral political terms, Phillips' thesis is simple, and I quote, America has a progressive, multiracial majority right now that has the power to elect presidents and reshape American politics, policies, and priorities for decades to come, unquote. This is brownness as mainstream coalition politics, explicitly modeled on Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition. Brown, Phillips says in an appendix clarifying his terminology, is quite bluntly a synonym for people of color. The power of Phillips' political arithmetic redescribes Asian and Arab, Native and African as all equally non-white, but only in order to claim rhetorically that this non-whiteness in fact adds up to the political equivalent of whiteness. Brown is the new white insofar as rendering whiteness in the numeric minority within the electorate supplies the recipe for progressive governance. It is not quite as simple as the mantra, demography is destiny, but then again, maybe it is almost as simple as that. Any comparative and transnational analysis of Black political culture, such as Phillips is emphatically not offering, and as we've heard repeatedly over the course of this conference, would certainly mitigate against such a confident reading of the so-called Browning of America. In making his argument, Phillips seems to succumb to what Afro-pessimist scholar Jared Sexton has termed people of color blindness, by which he means the deployment of phrases like brown and people of color as a means of perpetuating rather than contesting the ideological hold of anti-Blackness. Global white supremacy, as was discussed, is fully capable of construing itself as a demographic minority. Indeed, right-wing fears of being invaded and overrun by migrants from quote-unquote shithole countries are premised upon such fantasies of an impending deluge. It is because of the very openness with which such imaginaries now operate on the global right that we should insist upon making a distinction between minorities and the minoritarian. This distinction, which I derive from the work of scholars of queer of color critique, such as Munoz, Roderick Ferguson, and Amber Jamila Musser. Just parenthetically, I recall because she's in the audience, I recall about a decade ago, our comrade, Jana Brown, noticed that I had picked up the word minoritarian and challenged me to define what I meant. So maybe I'm very belatedly offering an answer to that question. There was another answer that involves like a long detour through the writings of Deleuze and Guattari, but I won't detain you with that one here today. Suffice it to say that the term minoritarian, unlike the term minority, is not a demographic term, but instead refers to a relation of dominance and subordination. Just as women can be a demographic majority and yet remain subordinated to men through patriarchy, or blacks can be in the majority of a given city, state, or nation and yet remain dominated by hegemonic elites, so the majoritarian refers more to a condition of acquiescence or resignation than anything so active as the progressive electoral coalition that figures like Phillips dream of. Here, a turn to the political and aesthetic theory of Sylvia Wynter is useful for giving this minoritarian sense of brownness a greater specificity. In rethinking aesthetics, notes towards a deciphering practice, Wynter continues her path-breaking project of excavating the social and symbolic conditions under which the violent overrepresentation of Western man is reproduced. Her essay takes a cue from Black geographer Clyde Taylor, for whom the question of aesthetics is always, quote, a non-dialogue between those who subscribe to the conditioned world order and those who stand to gain from a reconstructed forum, unquote. Wynter's essay lingers in the deep and dark time of this non-dialogue between the fugitive aesthetics of the oppressed and the normalizing, upwardly mobile aesthetics of what Taylor calls the conditioned world order. The political instrumentalization of ethno-racialized subjects, such as Phillips' offering, seeks to neutralize this antagonism by subsuming it within a mobilizing electoral strategy. How might we think about various imperatives in the academy to similarly contain difference within institutional frameworks? Already in her 1992 essay, Wynter is warning about such conceptual capture and recoding of insurgent Black aesthetics. Indeed, she warns over the course of her essay against the ethno-aesthetic trap that lies in store for those who see a cultural indigenous tradition inherent to these texts, which need merely be brought out by a new form of critical praxis. Such a strategy, she warns, concedes the grounds upon which the subjugated or interned population, whether or not is a demographic minority or majority, remains disselected from the cultural formations of taste out of which criticism reproduces itself. It becomes a neoliberal form of divide and conquer. In contrast to many of her post-structuralist contemporaries, Wynter does not in her essay adopt the stance that race is a social construction. Instead, she draws on a sociogenic model in which taste formations are literally inscribed in the human sensorium. As Zakiya Jackson has pointed out in particular, Winter's analytic is premised on the deep historical plasticity of race, for which her proposed deciphering practice follows from her postulating of a, quote, discursive cum biochemical causality, unquote. Rather than making the liberal humanist distinction between bad scientific racism and good colorblindness, Winter considers the genealogy of aesthetic judgment to have been directly enmeshed into the wiring of the sensorium. While many affect theories may run from any sort of causal argument, her cause is like discourse causes biochemical reality, I find it fruitful to linger in Winter's provocative insistence upon the biopolitical consequences of aesthetic judgment. Aesthetics are used to adjudicate who thrives and who does not, who is accepted as a dreamer and who is rejected as a criminal. Deciphering for Winter is a practice that begins in the flesh, construed here as the plasticity of the nervous system, and that she relates in a move that will return me to my opening example to an experience of nausea. The caca-bearing chusmeria in hybrid alternos remains illegible within the domestic politics of the plaintive and deserving asylum seeker, a bad joke that is insupportable in terms of political seriousness. And here I should say that the Troyano sisters are restaging their own real asylum stories from Cuba to the mainland US, but with increasingly thick layers of fabulation that work as protective coloration, right? Even as they reckon with their own relatively privileged status vis-a-vis other asylum seekers from, say, Haiti, right? So the brown gift of the chusma must be rejected by a fearful, neurotic body politic anxious to defend the purity of its whiteness against any possible contamination. Behind the nervous laughter, is a kind of nausea, one that Winter, building on Julia Kristeva, associated with the minoritarian aesthetics of the oppressed. This state, Winter writes, which is one of anxiety and is literally experienced as nausea, the desire to retch, to expel oneself, is induced by the inscription of a prohibited sign complex. The abject human hyena, operates in the performance as such a prohibited sign complex, prohibited perhaps even with the ethno-racializing terms of Latinx, a nauseating reminder of everything that must be expelled in order to produce a charmed circle of civic belonging. The border work of the hybrid is thus to speak back to hierarchies of taste, reason, and self-sovereignty. At one point in the play, Ella Troiano, stepping into the role of narrator-scientist, stages this abjection in terms of a derangement of human sex and gender. As narrator, she says, the spotted hyena is a very social animal belonging to complex matriarchal structures with a set hierarchy. The hyena is known for her high levels of androgens and testosterone, and it kind of goes on and on. One's thought to be a hermaphrodite, et cetera, et cetera. The human hyena hybrids within hybrid alternos thus function as allegories of the disselected, consigned to a lowbrow regime of the senses rather than a highbrow world of rational reflection or cultivated taste. The opening offering of excrement becomes an instance of the non-dialogue that Taylor references between those who subscribe to the conditioned world order and those who stand to gain from a reconstructed forum. Here, the posthumanism of the performance resonates with the words of another contemporary reader of Winter, Robert Reedfar, who in Archives of the Flesh posits that blackness may be that location ever filled with trash, detritus, and useless ephemera, but it is also a location of repudiation, negation, and critique. One of the few dodges available to the subject who has been discarded and discounted is indeed the ability to refuse, to resist rearticulation into dominant social and ideological structures. And here we can read the brownness of Hiei's Kakita through this blackness of refusal that Reedfar points us to. As a means of concluding my argument, I want to ask what suggestiveness, if any, this reading might have for an emergent black, brown, and queer aesthetic. One path towards an answer might be hazarded through considering how Winter's critique of aesthetics moves at one of its stages through a consideration of normativity. By the normativity of the aesthetic, I am evoking, of course, the queer theoretical critiques of the normative, from Foucault to Halberstam. The challenge Winter would seem to pose to this tradition surfaces in the interpretive practice that she calls deciphering. I have tried in this talk to decipher the brownness of hybridus alternos in this spirit, away from the normalizing regimes of multicultural identity, But I also recognize that deciphering must not remain just an interpretive practice, which merely reifies the critic as aesthetic, self-improving subject. It must also link up with a social poetics which is capable of fighting the powers that are currently arrayed against us. Queerness in the terms provided by Winter is not about transgressing norms in order to embrace one's true identity, but a planetary struggle to collectively remake the human. For Winter, the task of aesthetics is never a simple or straightforward transgressing of norms, such as could be accomplished by transvaluing forms of deviant sexuality or embodiment or acts and desires. We are not meant to become caca-wielding human hyenas, but to grasp in the shock of that affective encounter the reality of disselection and the necessity of wholesale transformation. The chusma is not to be redeemed from the stigma of disselection any more than the hyena hybrid is magically converted into a human ready for citizenship. In the post-performance discussion I was privy to, the performers explicitly rejected the idea that the planet Nebula was a queer utopia to which, once granted access, Hia and Bettina could finally be their true selves. Instead, the parodic form of the video asylum application, in which the death-dealing logics of the self-congratulatory state were thrown back in its face, insist upon performing these refugees as the figure that Winter calls the pariah, the one whose monstrous form and obscene speech declares, "We will not be what they want us to be." Thank you.
We have some time for questions. Anyone going to jump out there? Okay. Well, I will start with a question about this idea of that Tavia just mentioned about remaking the human, and with the emphasis more on the remaking that I think all of you talk about in some kind of way. And, you know, I think about it with Roshini's work with this is something also that Arthur Jafa talked about last night with this idea of found footage and saying, I'm not the found footage guy, right? Or Tina saying that about him. But I think found footage is something that surfaces in your work too. I mean, those kind of models that you show of, you know, kind of oil production are about the found footage. We can also think about it in your work, Kevin, when you're thinking about, you know, remaking this relationship to the banjo that Rhiannon works with. And then you also, Sandrine, thinking about not only recuperating this idea of the Afropolitan, but actually thinking about that, the way you're doing that is to think about how, I thought it was so provocative to think about, you know, this idea of the repatriation. We don't just need to talk about these ancient things, you know, that are 500 years old, but that these artists can't make their work to the same degree in their own countries, right? And of course, being Belgium, where you're talking about where this residency is, many of the artists are from DRC, right? So I want to think about that idea of the provocation, about how this is all about remaking. Do you see this as some kind of, you know, I hate to talk about trends, but how do you see this fitting in with our current moment? Or is that something that people have always done, you know? Anybody can jump in.
You
want to jump in? Go ahead,
I'll
go
just say
ahead.
super quickly. I mean, that's super. I want to hear from others, you know. But I think the widespread interest in speculative genres, in art and performance and beyond, speak directly to this remaking, and that there is, you know, at least in art practice in so many ways, I think leads so much of our thinking, right? Which needs to be intuitive insofar as if we follow the kind of Winter's proposal that we can't just simply take inherited canons of criticism, right, and institutional frameworks for understanding what's happening, but instead have to sort of remake the human from the ground up, as it were, right? Art, especially art that resonates in these transnational ways, I think is a very important site where this remaking can happen. At the same time, it's also a site of research, right? So even if it's not able to sort of display or affect that remaking in, I mean, it would be probably an exaggeration to say that it could happen like in a gallery or something, right? The research process, which is pointing to and connecting threads, I think would be one of the, one of those threads finally, I think, would be the increasing maybe interdiction of human movement, which I think a number of us spoke to, I think especially Sandrine. What does it mean to remake the human from below at a moment in time in which the already unequal movement of humans is even being more violently and virulently policed by the state and also by technology, right? You can go into airport now and facial recognition will will assign you your gate. It's already this one-to-one kind of correlation of tracking, which is a kind of remaking of the human, but in a very different sense than I think that any of us are talking about. I'm not sure.
I'm very interested in just kind of stepping back and thinking about the kind of the associations and the approaches to land and to approaches to senses of belonging and senses of the self that I find very intriguing in indigenous kind of communities. That, if you think about the idea of mapping, for example, of the landscape, it's thought about in a very different way. The relationship to the land is thought about in a very different way. And I think that it seems to me that these are memories that have been there for, in the world, in the planet, for a very, very long time. So it seems to me that looking to those kinds of First Nations and how that, how the issue of capital, how the issue of thinking about yourself as a subject can be gleaned from listening to that. I'm more interested in that. And that's to do with migration, and that's to do with movement, and that's to do with the occupancy of space.
Yeah, and I would have to say, I think of actually Rhiannon Giddens' work and the other sort of black banjoists, and there's an organization actually of black banjo players and mountain old-time music players. And I think it's not so much a remaking as a making of the human, right? And that's why I start with the reason the banjo makes it over from Africa, right? The banjar is because of those slave ships and those captains. It's not necessarily Africans carrying them over themselves. And so I think it's a project of making the human, the subject out of the object, that they're sort of wrestling with, and maybe in sense of remaking, the context out of which those humans appear sonically in sort of this now naturalized sense of what bluegrass and old-time music, right, sort of represents and signifies, and that they are remaking that in that sense. They're by sort of declaring their participation and their humanness, are remaking and refashioning that sort of context out of which those sounds and music has emerged.
What was very interesting while I was preparing this exhibition is that I had to think about the two different types of audience that to which this exhibition will be presented. So it will open in Brussels, then it will be presented in the Congo, which obviously made two very different audiences. And so when I thought about Brussels, Brussels is really the European center of, classical African arts market. It's even more so than Paris. A few kilometers from where this exhibition is going to be shown, there is, all this very luxurious and exclusive gallery, unabashedly using tribal arts. So for me it was very important because of the context of that audience to really foreground this, cosmopolitanism of African artists. I've been told as recently as last year by a professor of university in Brussels that contemporary African art was not really African because they were, it was not something I could take for granted when I was thinking about the exhibition. At the same time, I think, and as I said in the presentation, I thought it's, of course, I don't need to tell Congolese people that they are of the world. They know that. But I thought that it was, and here again, I want to specify that I talk about, every country is different in Africa, and I'm really making the case here for the Congo in particular and for Lubumbashi. But it was interesting that these people did not get to see the objects produced by their own artists. It's really not. The case in the Congo right now. What is really interesting too is that the Biennale has been founded by Sami Baloji, who is himself an artist. So it's really an artist-powered event and Biennale, which is really, really fantastic. And I wanted to just make. I wanted to specify something about Afropolitanism because I concentrated at this idea of the artistic residency. I did not speak about, the full concept of Afropolitanism, which really takes into account people of Indian descent, Chinese descent, who have been part of the African fabric, social fabric, for a very, very, very long time. So I just wanted to make sure that this was clear because Membe is really talking about not just this, West African continual connection, but he's really talking about, the mobilities within the continent, people from other regions of the world who have been part of African societies. And finally, one thing that I also like about, I kind of see, Afropolitan artists and all labels are incomplete, and we all know that, but I still think it's a valid concept also because I see it as an interesting counterpoint to the archival turn that have been, very present in non-Western art and African art. Also, I very often feel as a way to keep Europe in the center, using European archives, as long as you talk about me, at least you talk about me. And I think even if you about me, you still talk about me. So I think it's interesting that I see these artists and this other trend, if we can call it like that, of artists, really, even though, of course, they are informed by the post-colonial, doing something else in post-colonial art, which I think is really interesting.
Thank you. Love the art discussion. Kevin, this question is for you. You began your presentation with an image of that famous image of slave music making.
Right.
And I've been doing some work on this era, trying to determine the division of labor with gender and music making. In that painting, there's a man playing the banjo, and I think a man dancing. And I've been trying to think about, were women instrumentalists during the slave era? And then your presentation, of course, centered a woman instrumentalist. And you know about the Carter family and Maybelle Carter being credited with bringing a certain style of picking the guitar to country music and actually being an innovator.
Right.
Do you know what, I don't know this, what the answer is, but do you know what work is being done on this, and if the kind of picking that Maybelle was doing was related to the style of picking that you, guitar picking, banjo picking that you are talking about?
Yes, thanks for that. Well, first in that picture, the women that are dancing, that look like they're dancing, those are actually instruments. Right? Those are percussion instruments, actually. And it's kind of like beads or seeds or something are in there, and they're using it as a percussion instrument. So the women instrumentalists are present, right? Even in that early moment. as far as Maylene Carter and her fingerpicking style, apparently she did learn it from African American guitarists. So, I mean, that's the other thing, right? And especially in terms of the historiography of country music. In this, is, you know, one, like, you don't have to say which country you're talking about, right? The other thing is that, yeah, this is sort of the last genre that, right, that certain whites in that community are really resisting all of this new sort of musicians showing up and saying, no, this is black music, right, basically. And sort of finding this real resistance to it, because now it's like, so nothing, right? And it's like, yeah, that's right, right? You guys didn't think of anything. So, yeah. That in that sense, this is a real political work. That she's much more explicitly political in some ways than a lot of the artists. But I think, you know, in general, that general thrust of reorienting what does it, which country and whose country, right, gets played out much more. They're sort of really pushing that.
Thank you for this really fabulous panel. This question is mostly for Roshini. Thank you for your work. And it's about this conversation around the human. And I'm really thinking about, well, what if we destabilize the very idea of what human means in the first place, right? Like, what is it about being human that we want to preserve? What do we assume is the substrate of the human that we want to do anything with, you know? And this intersects with, you know, so for those of us who are excluded from the notion of the human, you know, what kind of freedom is that? That's what I'm asking. When we're untethered from this idea that we need to be included in protection of the social contract or whatever, you know, what other forms of existence can we imagine? I mean, this is the speculative turn, right? But it's related to what you were talking about in terms of, and I'm really interested to talk to you further about thinking ecologically. I mean, if we, you know, is there a freedom to decenter the human from our position, you know, in our relationship to the land, to these larger ecologies, which we can be enmeshed in. There's a question here somewhere, but you know, yeah. I mean, how would you respond to this idea of thinking of this conversation of the human in connection with this, what you're talking about in terms of the Black Anthropocene, or I forget how you phrased it.
I mean, I'm very conflicted as a photographer in relation to the human, because the Humanist Project and its association with photography has been part of photography's history. So for me, there is always, so as an artist, I'm almost thinking about how you move beyond the burden of that kind of representational process that needs to happen, it seems to me. So that's why I always turn to found footage often, but also the idea of how you might think about evoking that kind of non-human or inhuman thought through different mechanisms and through different aesthetics in a way. And I was intrigued by the work that Tavia actually presented for that reason. But on the other hand, I'm also, so one of the things that I find quite shocking, and I think we, you know, I mean, I saw it in Arthur's work as well yesterday, is this idea of what happens when you don't represent the human being, right? When you don't constitute the person visually. And I think that that's really, for me, becomes a relationship to the horror story. You know, the idea of the zombie, or the idea of the shock and horror that is implicit in this kind of post-humanist form that we now see exists in more mainstream media and in other works, or that there's this connection to the prosthetic of the animal, right? And so for me, I'm just kind of wrangling with that at the moment as to how to think through a visuality that actually is able to still contain both the kind of the tragedy and trauma and that we all experience through the memory of slavery and indentureship and everything else, but also, on the other hand, to think through how we might, and I think Chris Cozier's quote was quite interesting about the learning process that you go through of how to relate to somebody else through this process of the trauma. And so for me, there's something quite interesting about that relationability that Glissant also talks about, and the social being of the self, that is still very much captured in the human form, or you have a desire to still be that, right? And I just, so that's, for me, is the conflict. I don't know, I haven't really answered your question, but it's just, yes. I don't know, Tavia.
One last question we might have time for, or not? Yes, and Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul.
Hi. How's it going?
Good, how are you?
I was very curious about your idea about repatriation and contemporary African art, and I was wondering whether staging a show in Brussels requires the same kinds of engagements and thinking as staging it in Lubumbashi, or whether what happens in that movement from Brussels to the DRC?
I'm basically using Brussels for the Congo. I'm using the facilities, the logistics. It's having this show, transported to the Congo is very, very difficult. There's no post functioning in the Congo. Custom is like, you never know what's going to happen. So it's really, is this recorded?
It is, actually. Do you want to turn it off? You can turn it off.
They know that. So, but it's really, for me, it was important to, especially because many of these artists are from Lubumbashi, and they are shown at the time of the Biennale. But my hope is really for these works to actually be able to be shown permanently. There is one museum in Lubumbashi, and I would really love for that museum to actually dedicate a space that stays there all the time, not just for an event, and for young people to see, what their artists are producing, because, the Museum of the City of Lubumbashi is very much an ethnographic museum built in the 1950s by Belgian colonials. Very, very little has changed. And so for me, it's really important that it's not there as a temporary exhibition, because we all know the politics of, permanent collection versus temporary exhibition, and how it, the temporary does not really change the core of this exhibitionary complex. So it is hugely difficult logistically, but very important for me for that exhibition to travel and to actually, if possible, stay there for a time for people to be able to be really in contact with their art.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for staying with us today.